Hello and welcome to the Collapse Experiment. Today I'm talking about a book that I recently read and really recently finished this finally. And this is Wolf by Jim Harrison. This is an old paperback version that I found from 1973. 1973. So anyways, this is Jim Harrison's first novel. It's regarded as being like a false memoir, which Jim himself is the main character in the book in a way. So what we know about Jim Harrison's real life and what happens in this book are probably that drastically different, right? This is definitely, I think, in a way, how he wishes his early life had been as opposed to what it was. Jim was definitely a very masculine man's man, or at least tried to be, for a guy who wrote poetry from the very beginning and then eventually got into novellas and novels, script writing later on. The description for this book: a raunchy, funny, swaggering, angry, cocksure book. And it's that describes this to a T. It's the rambling adventures of a guy who it starts out with, he's in the woods of northern Michigan, and his sole purpose for being at this camp is that he wants to see a wolf out in the wild, which is a very hard thing to do. Wolves, for the most part, they avoid people, and it's not like you can just go out. And I'm sure I'm going to get comments on this video. It's like, well, I saw a wolf the first time I went out camping. But for the most part, like, you can't just go out and plan to see a wolf, right? You're more likely to see it if you live on a farm. If you live out like where I live, you're more likely to see a coyote or a fox. Definitely a fox. If you have chickens, you will see a fox. But as for a wolf, the wolf population as of right now is not all that great. They're pretty rare. And this was written back in the late 60s, early 70s. So I don't know what exactly the wolf population looked like in Michigan at that time. But the experience was supposed to change the man's life. And basically, this is, aside from the way that he wrote it, and I mean physically the way that he wrote it, it's almost very much like his version of Kerouac's On the Road. It's a guy who travels a lot. He's got, it seems like, women in every town that he goes to that he's able to just stay with, have sex, and then move on. There's a couple of chapters in here where he goes back to New York and he's talking about these different neighborhoods and places that he used to stay at. And there's this girl on this street and there's this girl on this street. And then by the end of the book, he goes on talking about how he comes to this town and like the 3-4 girls that he used to hook up with on the regular are all married. Which leads to his disappointment, because it definitely told the tale of like time is moving on. His dick swaggering days are coming to an end. Women are just not willing to play that game anymore. And it kind of, for me, it seemed like that was his moment of like, oh shit, it's time for me to like settle down and take life seriously. because throughout the book he's borrowing money from people to get from point A to point B. He's camping and living in his car, and he's basically doing all the things he can do in order to escape responsibility from the life that he knows is coming after his, I don't know, extended adolescence is over. I feel like that is one of the things that we can take away from the boomers, which Jim Harrison, was he a boomer? I believe he was born in the 30s, but I don't know. His writing and his life definitely. Does it say anywhere in here about the author? Not when he was born. So I feel like if there's one thing we can take away from the boomers and post World War II is that there definitely was a creation or a sense of like, it used to be before the war, you had childhood and adulthood. And there was this line where you went from, you have the irresponsibility and the fun and the social norm of being a child. And then there's a fine line where you are a man now, or you are a woman now, and it's time to grow up and have these responsibilities. And the baby boomers, the Kerouacs, the Allen Ginsbergs, the Harrisons, they grew up in a time where it was like, no, man, I don't have to grow up. Like, I can just write my stories and get paid for it and live big and enjoy life and screw responsibility. Like, that's for other people to do. And I feel like Wolf is definitely telling the story of like this guy trying to extend his teenage years into his 20s, and then eventually realizing that time moves on. You can't just continue to live that way. I didn't really feel like the Wolf had much to do with it. I feel like that might have been his last hurrah. And it wasn't the women that he was banging throughout the book. I feel like it was that moment, and perhaps it was the Wolf, right? Like, he's going around and he's having sex with all these different girls, and then when because it goes back and forth between him being in the woods looking for this wolf and camping, and at one point, so he's camping, he's seen the wolf, he's planning his route back to his car. He comes across this old, was it a bulldozer? Some type of tractor or something. I believe it was a bulldozer for like a logging company. And he's like, screw the logging company. And he takes a bunch of sand and he dumps it in the fuel tank. And I'm like, okay. Like, I don't understand the idea of like the people back then. Like, keep in mind, this was the time period we had that stupid commercial on TV of the Native American, and he's like got the tear running down his eye, and they're showing like pictures of pollution and deforestation. And yes, that was, I'll say, was a thing up here. But there is responsible logging, at least now, and there probably was back then too. It's just you had shitty people doing things like logging. I've seen the areas where they clear strip parts of different woods, like Deadstream Swamp, where there's one spot in the swamp in particular that I've been to where I don't know when the logging happened. It was well over a decade ago, and this place is not recovering. Meanwhile, you go 3-4 miles north of here, and there's a spot where pines are being sold to a logging company, and they're literally taking every other tree. They're like thinning the area so that more pines can grow up in between under the shelter of the trees that are left, and it's not just clear cut to where it looks like total garbage for decades on end. I don't know what the difference is, why exactly, if you just clear cut it, like no pines will come back up afterwards. But anyways, that part of the book kind of sort of bugged me, but I felt like maybe it was a tribute to the Monkey Wrench Gang, which is another popular book at around that time, of eco-terrorists going around trying to save the planet by screwing over corporations and people who unfortunately in the end work for a living and work dangerous jobs for a living. And then these people are going around making it even more dangerous for the people who, quite frankly, just want a paycheck in the end. And I don't know, maybe Harrison's opinion changed later on after Wolf, because logging and things of that nature do come into his later books. One of his characters, Brown Dog, he actually ends up working logging crews occasionally for extra money. So it does come into play in his works later on, where part of the story is his character's doing the same thing, where in his very first book, he's like sabotaging the crews, the equipment of the people who do this type of thing for a living. So I don't know if his opinion changed on it, but I feel like, in a sense, the book was fun. It was written well. It takes place where I live, so there was a lot of, not New York, Northern Michigan. It jumps around, but when it came to Northern Michigan, it was like, I know where that's at, I know where that's at, except for the UP. I'm still not that familiar with the UP, but Northern Lower Michigan, which a lot of it takes place, which is where Jim Harrison was from. It was entertaining. It was fun. A lot of it was fairly unique. I like his descriptions on different things. The characters, he's able to write fairly well characters without being too descriptive. And I feel like it was a immature first attempt at a novel from a guy who would eventually blossom into writing a lot of really good novellas and novels later on that I thoroughly enjoyed. I felt like this was like getting a lot of his sexual angst out on the page so that he can move on to other things. Which, granted, later on, a lot of his later books had a lot to do with sex. Like, sex was definitely a thing, and Brown Dog got laid quite a bit in those novellas and stories that he wrote later on. But it wasn't the sole aspect of the story like a lot of this is, where it's like, I'm in New York. Hey, I remember this girl that lived on this street. I'm going to go see her. Yeah. So basically it's an interesting, entertaining romp through the life of a young man who realizes it is time to grow up later on. That is what Wolf is. And no, it's not. Unfortunately, that is the name of the book, considering that 20 years later, he would write a movie script of the same name starring Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer. If you're familiar with that movie, it is not based on this. I was an idiot for thinking that, but how the hell was I supposed to know? I wasn't all that familiar with Jim Harrison at the time. I shouldn't be surprised that he's going to take one title and recycle it off to something else, and that's really about it. Like, there really isn't too much to say about the plot of this book, other than his name is Swanson, and he is alone and adrift for a week in the Michigan woods. Yeah, the part where he's in the woods looking for the wolf, which it comes and goes throughout the whole book, is the span of a week. Restless rootless young vagrant. He's looking for a wolf, an animal symbolizing for him one of the few free spirits left on Earth. Yeah, and his freedom is coming to a close. So anyways, that is Wolf by Jim Harrison. It's an interesting story. He does also integrate the story. Like, Swanson is the name of the character, but at the same time, he does talk about, at least with the character, who's obviously based on him, the car wreck that killed his father and his sister or brother, one of his siblings. They were going on a fishing trip, and then eventually, like, he kept going back and forth as to whether or not he was going to go, and eventually he said he wasn't going to go, and they would have left earlier had he just agreed to it or made up his damn mind. And they died in this horrible car accident. And that was one of the stories in this. It was something that he had been dealing with for a long, long time. Who knows whether or not he ever really got over it. But he kind of blamed himself, which I think is not unfair to do. Like, if you were in a situation where you kept going back and forth as to whether or not you wanted to do something, and then you're postponing your decision is what led to, in your mind, the death of two people in your life that you cared about, you're going to feel some guilt about that. Oh, they would have left 2 days earlier. They never would have been on that road where that truck hit them head on. Yeah, you're going to feel some guilt about that. And who knows? Maybe that's what led to all the drinking and stuff later on. Because Harrison was a notorious drinker. At one point he was asked, like, how is it that now you're writing like a book a year, where previously it was every couple of years? And he's like, well, when you're drinking a gallon of vodka per day, you don't get much done. And then he just stopped drinking. Maybe that was when he finally came to terms with what had happened. I don't know. So anyways, that is Wolf by Jim Harrison. If you find a copy of this book, I would recommend it. You don't find books of this nature anymore. It's not something that would be published today. Definitely not. So it's one of those now rare examples of a cocksure, dick swaggering tale, if you will. Wolf by Jim Harrison, his first novel. I would recommend it. Check it out. It's not the greatest book of his, but at the same time, it really sets the standard for a lot of his stuff later on. So if you've read any Jim Harrison, enjoyed it, let me know in the comment section. And until next time, keep on typing.